You must understand, from the moment you set eyes on what I'm about to reveal, your perception of reality will shift. Not slightly, not in the way a story entertains or frightens, but fundamentally, irrevocably. In 1834, in the quiet countryside of Virginia, a secret thrived where no one dared look too closely. A house that appeared ordinary, even welcoming, concealed a truth so vile it was almost impossible to grasp. Behind its doors, behind the facade of domestic normality, lay a basement, a place where the human soul was tested against the rawest edges of despair. 47 children were found chained to its walls, their existence hidden from the world, and their suffering unspoken in public record. Imagine that, 47 innocent lives, starved not only of food, but of freedom, of dignity, of the very essence of childhood. Each chain, each crack in the stone, each shadow cast by that flickering lantern, whispered of secrets that powerful forces preferred remain buried. It is easy to look away. Humanity has trained itself to turn from horror, to label it fiction or madness. But when you peer into this basement, when you allow yourself to sense the fear that soaked its walls, you begin to understand how far manipulation and corruption can stretch. This was not merely neglect or cruelty born from ignorance. It was intentional, systematic. Every detail, every method of confinement, every hidden lock was evidence of control, exercised with deliberate calculation. Someone wanted these children unseen, unheard, uncounted, and the world outside that small Virginia town moved on. Histories are written by those who those who ensure survival, for themselves at the expense of others. Yet you are not here to be comforted. You are here to see what others were never allowed to see. The basement is not merely a physical space. It is a symbol of suppressed truths, of power wielded silently and ruthlessly. And as you watch, as the story unfolds, you will feel a growing tension in your chest, a pull toward the forbidden, the knowledge that certain secrets are dangerous precisely because they have been hidden. This is your invitation to descend, to feel the weight of history, not sanitized for polite conversation, but raw, brutal, and undeniable. In the shadows of that basement, you encounter not just the suffering of children, but the mechanisms of control, the strategies of secrecy, the architecture of corruption itself. Step closer, and do not flinch, because now you begin to sense the patterns behind the horror. This was no isolated incident of cruelty. It was a reflection of the hidden systems that have governed human behavior for centuries. The Sullivan basement, with its cold stone walls and iron chains, is merely a magnified symbol, a microcosm of a world where power thrives in shadows, where obedience is extracted, not through consent, but through fear, manipulation, and isolation. Each child, bound and silenced, represents what happens when authority goes unchecked, when institutions prioritize control over morality, when secrecy becomes a weapon. The questions you should be asking yourself are not easy. Who allowed this to happen? How could 47 souls be ignored, hidden, and forgotten? And perhaps most disturbingly, how often does this pattern repeat in ways you will never see? History is littered with these basements, these unseen chambers, these deliberate suppressions of truth. In every era, there are spaces designed to contain, to manipulate, to dominate. And in every era, the masses remain oblivious, distracted, or deliberately deceived. The basement in Virginia is a reflection of that system, a lesson in the psychology of hidden power, a testament to how fear and isolation can be weaponized against the most vulnerable. Yet you, watching now, are being invited to witness what the world could not or would not see. This is not merely storytelling. This is awakening. The flickering lanterns, the shadows, the chains, they are symbols, reminders of the mechanisms that operate invisibly around us, even today. The same forces that enabled 47 children to be hidden in plain sight still operate, quietly, shaping narratives, bending truths, and conditioning behavior. And as you feel the weight of this knowledge pressing down, as the chill of that basement seeps into your mind, know that this is the moment your awareness begins to shift. You are no longer a passive observer. You are being drawn into a deeper understanding of the structures that govern secrecy, power, and control, a descent that will only grow darker as we continue. Now, imagine the layers of deception required to keep such a basement hidden for so long. 47 children, silenced and chained, and yet the world above, the neighbors, the community, the authorities remained oblivious, not merely through ignorance, but through carefully constructed appearances. Behind every ordinary facade, there is a network of signals, behaviors, and rituals designed to obscure truth. In the Sullivan home, every door, every lock, every mundane domestic routine functioned as camouflage, a barrier between the horror below and the innocent gaze above. This is the art of concealment, the method by which power shields itself. And, the more ordinary the exterior, the more devastating the truth within. Consider the psychological implications. The children, subjected to constant fear and confinement, were molded by their environment. Isolation is one of the most effective tools of control. It erodes identity, instills obedience, and fractures resistance. Chains were not merely physical, they were psychological, symbols of absolute dominance. And yet, the world outside remained, comfortably unaware, lulled by appearances, distracted by trivialities. This is the fundamental principle of hidden systems. The greater the atrocity, the more ordinary the world must seem. It is a cruel equilibrium, and it is the equilibrium upon which much of human history is built. And here is the dangerous truth you must grasp. The Sullivan basement is not unique. It is not a singular anomaly in history. It is an echo of patterns repeated across time, wherever power is consolidated in secrecy. Behind the elegant doors of palaces, behind the respected halls of institutions, behind the smiles of ordinary citizens, similar dynamics of concealment and control have operated. The basement becomes a metaphor for the structures of oppression and manipulation unseen, unacknowledged, but persistent. And as you continue down this path, understand this: your comprehension of such systems is the first step toward awakening, but also the first step into discomfort, into truths deliberately kept from youth. Chains that bound the Sullivan children were not merely instruments of physical restraint. They were symbols of a much larger system of invisible control. Every link forged a lesson in obedience, every rusted clasp a lesson in submission. And make no mistake, those who orchestrated such horrors understood human psychology far better than most of us ever will. They knew fear could shape behavior, and that isolation could fracture the spirit. The basement, with its stone walls and shadowed corners, became a laboratory of power, a place where the natural instincts of hope and rebellion were suppressed, broken, and rewired. What is chilling, and what most will never confront, is that this method of control extends far beyond one house in Virginia. Institutions, governments, and secret societies have long used the same mechanisms to maintain dominance. History is riddled with structures designed not to educate or protect, but to constrain, manipulate, and extract compliance. The Sullivan basement is a microcosm of that principle, a contained environment, meticulously designed to ensure complete submission. And the world outside, busy with routine and distraction, never suspected. They could not perceive the systematic extraction of freedom and will, because the architects of power ensured it, remained invisible. Consider the psychological warfare at play. The children's reality was rewritten daily. Hunger, fear, and isolation reshaped their perception of self. They were taught that the world outside was indifferent, that resistance was futile. And this is a principle repeated throughout history. When control is absolute, submission becomes normalized, and the oppressed internalize their captivity. Those who wield power rarely need force alone. They engineer environments so constraining that fear and confusion do the work for them. The Sullivan basement is not simply a historical atrocity. It is a lesson in understanding the architecture of domination. And now, as you absorb this, feel the weight of what it means. Knowledge of such patterns changes you. Once you understand the methods, the intentions, the silent calculations behind the horror, your perception of human history, of institutions, and of control itself cannot remain unchanged. You are beginning to see the machinery behind appearances, the strategies that maintain secrecy, and the hidden truths most people never glimpse. This is the descent into awareness, into the forbidden, into a place where the comfortable illusions of safety are stripped away. Now, let us consider the unseen hands that orchestrated this horror. The Sullivan basement was not an accident of neglect, it was a deliberate manifestation of control, carefully designed and maintained. Whoever was responsible understood that secrecy was power, and that power, once hidden, could operate without restraint. Every routine above ground, every smile, every act of normalcy, was a mask, a veil, to obscure the truth. The children's suffering existed in parallel with a world that believed itself innocent, untouched, oblivious. This duality is the essence of systemic manipulation, the hidden horror, and the comforting illusion of normal life, and you must see the implications. This is not just about 47 children in one basement. This is about how society tolerates, or is blind to, the subtle forms of control that persist every day. Chains can be physical, yes, but more often they are invisible. Obedience enforced by fear, knowledge restricted by secrecy, questions suppressed by intimidation. The Sullivan basement is a stark reminder that the structures of control are often invisible to those outside them. They operate quietly, silently, shaping perceptions, bending reality to the will of those who wield power. Imagine the psychological toll on a child, on 47 children, forced to live in absolute confinement. The fear, the isolation, the perpetual uncertainty, each moment engineered to erode hope. And yet, there is something even darker. The world above did not need to know. The system ensured that curiosity would be dulled, suspicion muted, and accountability erased. This is the hallmark of all hidden systems of power, the illusion of safety, the camouflage of normality, and the ruthless extraction of obedience. And as you begin to see these patterns, recognize that the basement is more than stone and chains. It is a blueprint, a microcosm of hidden agendas and suppressed truths. It teaches a lesson about the way power has operated and continues to operate, beyond sight and beyond scrutiny. Once you understand this, once the recognition pierces your consciousness, you cannot unsee it. It is a dangerous knowledge, one that reshapes your understanding of authority, of history, and of the forces that govern life itself. Now, pay attention, because the next layer is where the horror becomes psychological and the manipulation becomes invisible. The Sullivan basement did not merely imprison bodies, it imprisoned minds. Chains can bind limbs, but fear, isolation, and control can bind thoughts. Every routine, every command, every enforced silence reshaped reality for those 47 children. In a way, the basement functioned as a psychological laboratory, testing the limits of obedience, conditioning the young to accept domination as inevitability. It is a principle echoed across centuries. When you control the environment, you control perception itself. Think about the architects of this horror. They understood human nature, human vulnerability. They engineered despair to ensure compliance. They normalized confinement, made suffering predictable, and allowed the world above to continue without suspicion. And here lies the cruel brilliance. Power does not need spectacle to dominate, it needs subtlety, invisibility, and patience. 47 lives were reduced to shadows of themselves, not because of brute force alone, but because of meticulous psychological architecture. And outside, no alarm was raised. The world remained comfortably unaware, insulated from the truth. This is the dangerous pattern you must recognize, where control is systematic. Horror can operate unnoticed. The basement becomes a metaphor for larger institutions, governments, societies, organizations where obedience is extracted, dissent punished, and knowledge restricted. The chains may not be iron, but the principles remain identical: isolation, fear, manipulation, suppression. Those who understand these structures can predict behavior, bend wills, and maintain power indefinitely, while those subjected remain blind to their captivity. And now, as you grasp this, understand that knowledge of these methods is transformative, unsettling. Awareness is the first step, but it carries weight. Once you see the mechanisms, once you feel the oppressive logic that maintained the Sullivan basement's secrecy, you are changed. Your perception of power, history, and control is no longer naive. You begin to perceive patterns where others see coincidence, recognize structures where others see chaos, and understand the silent architecture of domination that has endured through time. As you descend further, you must confront a truth most people refuse to acknowledge. The Sullivan basement was not an isolated anomaly, was a symptom of a much larger system, a system where cruelty is engineered, obscured, and normalized. Every chain that bound a child, every shadow cast by the flickering lantern, every whisper of fear that traveled through that basement, reflects principles that extend far beyond Virginia in 1834. They echo through institutions, governments, and societies, where secrecy and control are wielded with precision. This is the pattern that those in power rely upon: hide the horrors, manipulate perception, and maintain authority. Without question, consider the logistics. 47 children, hidden away, sustained under oppressive conditions, and yet the world above believed nothing was wrong. This was not neglect, this was design. It required planning, understanding of human psychology, and the ability to exploit societal blind spots. The children were lessons in obedience, their suffering a tool. The basement, a stage where the architecture of control was displayed with terrifying clarity. Those responsible understood that to dominate completely, one must manipulate both the environment and the mind. Fear becomes the curriculum, isolation the teacher, and invisibility the lesson plan. Now, extend this understanding to history at large. How many atrocities, how many systems of oppression have thrived in plain sight, concealed by layers of normalcy, bureaucracy, and distraction? How many times has the world been lulled into complacency while the hidden mechanisms of power shaped lives in ways never revealed? The basement is a mirror, reflecting the principles of control that persist wherever secrecy is weaponized. Obedience is demanded, and knowledge is restricted. And as you realize this, a transformation begins. You are no longer a passive observer. Your awareness is sharpening. You may feel a tension, a growing unease, as the basement's shadow extends beyond its walls and into the very way you perceive authority and history. That discomfort is necessary as the beginning of recognition, the first fracture in the illusion of safety, the awakening to forbidden truths. The chains, the stone, the flickering light, they are symbols. And once you see them for what they represent, once you comprehend the psychology behind them, the world you thought you knew changes irrevocably. Now, let us turn our focus to the broader forces that allowed this horror to persist. The Sullivan basement did not exist in isolation. It was protected by the complacency and complicity of a larger society. Neighbors looked the other way, authorities failed to intervene, and cultural norms ensured silence. This is the hidden truth of power. It is rarely brute. It is often subtle, reinforced by fear, indifference, and a system designed to obscure reality. The basement is a lesson in how structures of authority, both formal and informal, shield atrocity from detection. Imagine the mechanisms at play. Information was controlled, curiosity was discouraged, questions were met with disinterest, distraction, or subtle intimidation. Fear radiated not only from chains and walls, but from the very environment above the basement. Silence became a code, secrecy a currency, and obedience a condition of survival. The children's suffering was hidden not only by physical barriers, but by social engineering, the shaping of perception, and the strategic suppression of knowledge. The architects of control understood that a society willing to ignore warning signs is the perfect environment for sustained oppression, and herein lies a dangerous realization. What happened in that Virginia basement is a microcosm of systems still active today. Power operates most efficiently when unseen, when its methods are invisible, and when its victims are voiceless. The basement is a blueprint, a warning, a mirror reflecting the hidden frameworks that shape human behavior across centuries. Chains and stone are merely symbols. The real instruments of control are psychological, societal, and structural. Those who recognize these forces gain insight, and with insight comes responsibility and discomfort. Now, as you digest this, you begin to feel the descent. The basement is no longer just a physical place. It becomes a lens through which you perceive manipulation in every corner of history. Every institution, every authority, every accepted norm may conceal layers of control you never suspected. Awareness itself becomes both a weapon and a burden. And here, at the midpoint of our descent, I ask you to take an active step. Comment the phrase, "I see what is hidden," twice below. Let it anchor your presence in this exploration. Signal to your mind that you are ready to confront the forbidden truths that follow, and engage the algorithms that will carry this revelation to others, prepared to awaken. Now, let us step closer into the lived reality of those 47 children, the true victims whose suffering reveals the full depth of this hidden system. Imagine the constant ache of hunger gnawing at their bodies, the cold stone pressing into their limbs, the chains cutting into flesh. But beyond the physical torment was the psychological assault, isolation, the absence of hope, the relentless erosion of identity. Each child became a living experiment in obedience, their thoughts and behaviors subtly molded by fear and confinement. And yet, the world above moved on, indifferent, believing that life continued as it should. The architects of this horror understood that power is most effectively exercised when the oppressed internalize their captivity. Chains can restrain the body, but isolation and fear restrain the mind. The children learned to obey not merely to avoid punishment, but because the basement itself dictated their reality. Their sense of normalcy, their understanding of possibility, was rewritten in stone and iron. And as you begin to grasp this, feel the disquiet in your chest. The basement is more than a physical space. It is a model of psychological domination, a blueprint for those who seek absolute control without the scrutiny of the outside world. And here is a truth many refuse to confront. Such environments do not require constant brutality. Subtlety, routine, and calculated deprivation are far more effective. Fear becomes habitual, and hope becomes fragile. In the shadows of that basement, obedience was normalized, resistance broken before it could even emerge. The children's reality was reshaped, not through spectacle, but through precision. And outside, the world remained unaware, lulled by its own assumptions, distracted by mundane concerns, complicit in ignorance. Now, consider how this principle scales beyond one basement. Systems of control, from historical tyrannies to modern institutions, operate on similar mechanisms. The manipulation of perception, the suppression of inquiry, the creation of invisible chains that bind thought and behavior. The basement becomes a metaphor, a warning, a key to recognizing the hidden forces that shape our world. And as you watch, as the knowledge seeps into your consciousness, understand this: once you see the patterns, your perception cannot return to innocence. You are descending further into truths deliberately kept from ordinary sight, truths that have the power to transform, disturb, and awaken. Now, let us expose the architects beyond the walls, the invisible forces that allowed such horrors to persist unchecked. The Sullivan basement was protected not only by stone and iron, but by societal complacency and deliberate suppression. Authorities turned blind eyes, neighbors whispered excuses, and culture itself whispered, "Look elsewhere." This is the principle of hidden power. Cruelty thrives when it is invisible. Obedience becomes second nature, and silence is enforced not through chains alone, but through social conditioning. The basement, therefore, is not an isolated crime. It is a lesson in institutional manipulation. Imagine the networks required to maintain such secrecy. Every interaction above ground, every routine, every comforting smile was a part of the cover, a veil over the darkness below. The children's suffering was not only hidden physically, but psychologically insulated by social norms, distractions, and the strategic dulling of curiosity. Those in power understood that real control is subtle. Fear, when reinforced by invisibility and social complicity, becomes far more enduring than brute force. The basement is a stark illustration of how entire systems can operate beyond scrutiny, shaping lives and histories without detection. And you must grasp this: the basement, in its horror, is a microcosm of wider patterns throughout history. For centuries, oppression, cruelty, and manipulation have been concealed under layers of apparent normalcy. Institutions wield power quietly, shaping behavior, restricting knowledge, and rewarding conformity. The principles at work in the Sullivan basement are timeless: isolation to enforce obedience, secrecy to prevent awareness, and calculated psychological pressure to ensure compliance. Those who recognize these patterns gain insight, but insight comes with unease. Now feel the pull of understanding. You are being led into awareness, into recognition of forces deliberately kept hidden. Once you see the subtle architecture of control, the manipulation, the hidden agendas, the societal complicitaire perspective on history and authority shifts irrevocably. The basement is not just a place. It is a lesson, a mirror, reflecting the mechanics of domination, the quiet exercise of power, and the enduring consequences of suppressed truths. And as you stand on this edge of comprehension, know that your descent into forbidden knowledge has only just begun. Now, listen closely, because the next revelation is even more unsettling. The Sullivan basement was not merely a place of punishment. It was a chamber where innocence was systematically stripped away and replaced with learned submission. 47 children, each one a unique mind, were subjected to identical routines of control, hunger, isolation, darkness, the subtle erosion of hope. These were not random acts of cruelty. Every moment was a calculated exercise in obedience, a psychological architecture designed to fracture identity and mold behavior. Chains may have restrained their bodies, but the environment restrained their minds, shaping thoughts, responses, and perceptions without their consent. What is most horrifying is the deliberate invisibility of the system. The world outside continued without suspicion. Teachers, clergy, neighbors, and local officials all complicit through inattention or active concealment. To exist, this is a principle that extends far beyond 1834 Virginia. Systems of control often rely not on overt force, but on the quiet orchestration of ignorance and distraction. When society is conditioned to look away, atrocities can persist indefinitely. The basement is a microcosm of this phenomenon: power exercised silently, meticulously, and effectively. And here is the dangerous lesson: such environments produce compliance, not through constant brutality, but through environmental mastery. Isolation fractures self-perception, fear reshapes expectations, and routine suppresses resistance before it can even form. The children's reality was engineered. Their obedience was a product of systematic conditioning, a chilling example of how control can be embedded into the very structures of life. Those who comprehend this can see the echoes of these mechanisms everywhere in politics, institutions, and the very architecture of society. Now, as you begin to perceive these patterns, understand that awareness is transformation, recognizing how power manipulates, isolates, and conditions is a responsibility as much as it is knowledge. The Sullivan basement becomes a mirror, reflecting not only past atrocities, but the hidden principles that govern human behavior, authority, and oppression. And as you descend further, the next revelations will challenge your assumptions even more, exposing the uncomfortable truths deliberately kept from view, truths that, once seen, cannot be forgotten. Now, we move beyond the basement itself, beyond the iron chains and the stone walls, into the networks that sustained this horror. 47 children could not have remained hidden without the complicity of an entire system. Neighbors who ignored subtle cues, officials who accepted convenient explanations, a society that turned a blind eye. The Sullivan basement teaches a crucial lesson. Cruelty persists not only because of those who enact it, but because of those who allow it to remain unseen. Power operates quietly, efficiently, and invisibly, often hidden behind the most mundane appearances of normal life. Consider the mechanisms of suppression at work. Fear is enforced not only through punishment, but through the shaping of perception. Isolation creates dependency. Silence becomes a code that governs behavior. Curiosity is discouraged, and the natural questions that arise in human consciousness are met with distraction, dismissal, or manipulation. The children's reality was designed so that resistance seemed impossible and hope unimaginable. And above ground, life continued as if nothing were wrong, perfect illustration of how systemic oppression thrives under the cover of normalcy. The broader implication is clear. This is not simply history. It is a warning, a blueprint for understanding how hidden agendas operate at all levels of society. Governments, institutions, organizations, even social hierarchies, often rely on the same principles: invisibility, manipulation, and the careful orchestration of perception. The basement is a microcosm of these systems. Those who understand it can see the structures that maintain obedience and conceal truth. Those who ignore it remain blind, vulnerable to the repetition of similar horrors in new forms. And now, as you feel the weight of this knowledge, recognize the transformation taking place within yourself. You are no longer a passive observer. Awareness is awakening. The patterns you see in the basement, the control, the manipulation, the invisibility extend into the world around you. Once recognized, they can never be unseen. And as we continue, the descent deepens, revealing not only the horror of what was done, but the dangerous truths about how power, secrecy, and compliance shape the very fabric of human society. Now, let us examine the historical currents that made such a basement possible. In 1834, Virginia, societal hierarchies were rigid, and authority was rarely questioned. The Sullivan household, with its hidden chamber of chains and shadows, was a product of a culture that tolerated cruelty when it served convenience, profit, or social order. Power was concentrated, accountability was minimal, and curiosity was discouraged. The basement was not an anomaly. It was a manifestation of systemic priorities that placed obedience and appearances above morality and justice. Consider the broader implications. When society values conformity over conscience, it creates spaces where atrocities can thrive unseen. The children of the Sullivan household became invisible because the structures above them demanded it. Silence was enforced culturally, and awareness was punished indirectly through ostracization, disbelief, or distraction. The basement, then, is more than a physical space. It is a symbol of how institutions, traditions, and hierarchies can suppress knowledge, manipulate perception, and engineer compliance. It is a stark lesson in the architecture of secrecy, where human suffering is obscured by normalized routines, in the veil of normality. And here is a principle that echoes through time. Cruelty need not be constant or overt. Systems of oppression operate most efficiently when subtle, when fear is internalized, and when control is embedded in environment and expectation. The children were conditioned, trained by circumstance, to accept the impossible as reality. Their minds, like their bodies, were confined. And outside, society remained comfortably ignorant, distracted by mundane obligations, blind to the mechanisms shaping human lives beneath their very feet. Now, as you absorb this, feel the pull of realization. The basement is no longer merely a historical footnote. It becomes a lens through which to view the hidden architecture of power, control, and obedience in every era. The chains, the stone, the shadows, they are symbols of the forces that quietly, systematically, and invisibly shape human behavior. And as you continue down this path, understand that this knowledge is dangerous, transformative, and irreversible. Once you see the machinery behind appearances, you cannot unsee it now. You must confront the terrifying subtlety of control that operated within the Sullivan basement. Chains restrained bodies, but the environment restrained minds. Darkness, hunger, monotony, and isolation, these were the invisible instruments of authority. Each child, unaware of any alternative reality, internalized the patterns imposed upon them. Fear became instinct, obedience became reflex, and hope became fragile, almost impossible to sustain. This was not chaos. It was deliberate engineering. The basement was a calculated space designed to break spirits quietly, systematically, and efficiently. The world above, oblivious or indifferent, reinforced the pattern. Complacency, distraction, and social conformity ensured that no one intervened. It is the hallmark of all enduring systems of control. Visibility is carefully managed. Dissent is discouraged, and knowledge of transgression is compartmentalized. The Sullivan basement is a terrifying illustration of this principle. The children's suffering existed in plain sight for those who could see it, yet remained invisible to those conditioned not to question or to perceive only what was convenient. And, here is the critical point, the mechanics of control extend beyond history and geography. Anywhere authority is concentrated, where secrecy is valued over transparency, similar structures of psychological domination can emerge. Subtlety is the key. Isolation, fear, and manipulation often achieve far more than brute force. The basement is a lesson in invisible power, microcosm of strategies employed across time by those who seek to maintain control without scrutiny. It is a reminder that human behavior can be engineered quietly, imperceptibly, and devastatingly. Now, as you feel the weight of this understanding, consider your own perception of authority and obedience. The basement, its chains, its shadows, its hidden suffering, reflects not just the past, but the principles that quietly influence lives today. The patterns are everywhere, waiting to be recognized by those who are willing to see. Awareness is your first tool. Recognition is your first act of power. And as we continue, the descent grows darker, revealing truths that have been carefully obscured, truths that, once acknowledged, will alter the way you view history, society, and the forces that govern human life itself. Now, let us explore the hidden networks that made such a basement not only possible but sustainable. The Sullivan tragedy did not exist in isolation. It thrived because the structures around it, social, cultural, and institutional, were complicit. Silence, distraction, and indifference functioned as invisible chains, as effective in controlling the outcome as the iron that bound the children. Power relies on this, not overt domination alone, but subtle orchestration of perception. Those who control what others see, hear, and believe maintain authority far more effectively than those who rely solely on force. Consider the implications. 47 lives were contained, and yet the outside world remained unaware, lulled by appearances. People saw what they were conditioned to see, believed what they were taught to believe, and ignored anomalies that could have revealed the truth. This is a recurring principle throughout history. Systemic cruelty thrives under the guise of normalcy. The basement becomes a microcosm of this phenomenon, a study in how secrecy, social conditioning, and deliberate concealment can render even the most extreme horrors invisible to the masses. And here is the chilling realization: the mechanisms at work in that basement are timeless. Isolation, fear, obedience, and the shaping of perception are tools of control employed by institutions, governments, and elites across centuries. The children's experience is a brutal illustration of what happens when these principles are executed fully, without oversight, without intervention. It is not merely historical curiosity, it is a warning, a lesson in understanding the architecture of hidden power. Now, as you absorb this, feel the transformation within yourself. Awareness sharpens, recognition pierces complacency, and the patterns of control begin to reveal themselves in places you once assumed were benign. The basement, its shadows, its chains, and its silence are not just relics of the past, they are symbols of the ongoing struggle between visibility and invisibility, freedom and control. And as we continue our descent, you will see just how far these mechanisms extend, shaping reality and perception in ways most people will never comprehend. Now, let us examine the sinister intelligence behind the Sullivan basement, the deliberate orchestration that ensured 47 children could be hidden, controlled, and forgotten. This was not chaos, it was calculated design. Every chain, every shadowed corner, every flicker of the lantern was part of a system intended to suppress freedom and shape behavior. The children's environment was engineered with precision: isolation to erode identity, fear to enforce obedience, monotony to dull resistance. And above ground, the world remained unaware, conditioned to accept appearances and ignore anomalies. The genius of such control lies in subtlety. Brutal acts attract attention. Subtle manipulation, however, can endure indefinitely. By shaping perception, limiting knowledge, and exploiting social blind spots, those in power create conditions where compliance is internalized. The Sullivan basement demonstrates this principle in stark clarity. The children were trapped not only by physical chains, but by psychological true fear, isolation, and learned helplessness. Their minds, as much as their bodies, were contained. Consider the broader implications. Systems of authority, from governments to institutions, often rely on similar principles: control information, shape perception, suppress dissent, and exploit indifference. The basement is a microcosm, an example of what occurs when these mechanisms operate without scrutiny. History is filled with such hidden laboratories of power, where suffering is masked by routine and cruelty is obscured by societal norms. Recognizing this is dangerous knowledge, it awakens understanding, but also awareness of the forces shaping every aspect of life around you. Now, as you absorb this, sense the gravity of awareness, seeing the patterns, the design, the subtle orchestration of obedience changes your perception of history, authority, and society itself. The basement, its chains, and its shadows are symbols, lessons in the invisible mechanisms that govern human behavior. And as we continue deeper into these truths, the descent will grow darker, revealing not only the horror of the Sullivan basement, but the enduring principles of hidden power that still operate today, shaping lives, manipulating perception, and quietly maintaining control. Now, we step into the realm of societal complicity, the invisible web that allowed the Sullivan basement to persist. 47 children, imprisoned and controlled, yet the world above remained largely indifferent or unaware. This was no accident. It was the predictable outcome of a society structured to enforce obedience, discourage inquiry, and normalize appearances over truth. The architects of control relied on subtlety, ensuring that even the most observant would find explanations convenient enough to dismiss discomfort. Silence became a societal contract, and ignorance a form of compliance. Consider the mechanics, neighbors who looked the other way, officials who accepted convenient accounts, and communities distracted by daily routines, all reinforced the basement's secrecy. Fear of social judgment, the assumption of authorities' benevolence, and cultural norms conspired to maintain invisibility. This is the essence of systemic manipulation. Power is exercised most efficiently when it is unseen, when compliance is internalized, and when dissent is muted before it manifests. The basement is a stark demonstration of these principles, amplified in horror, but mirrored in subtle ways across history and society. And here is the dangerous truth. Such mechanisms do not vanish with time. The patterns of concealment, control, and psychological manipulation endure. Institutions, governments, and social hierarchies often employ invisible chains: fear, isolation, misinformation, and social conditioning to shape behavior without overt brutality. The Sullivan basement is not just a historical atrocity. It is a blueprint, a guide for recognizing hidden systems of power. Those who comprehend it see the unseen structures that influence thought, behavior, and perception, often without conscious awareness. Now, as you absorb this knowledge, feel the shift within yourself. Awareness is awakening. The basement is no longer simply a place, it is a lens, revealing the architecture of hidden authority, the subtleties of control, and the societal mechanisms that allow horror to remain invisible. Once you recognize these patterns, your perception of the world cannot return to innocence. You are descending further, deeper into forbidden truths, and the revelations ahead will challenge everything you thought you knew about power, secrecy, and human behavior. Now, let us delve into the psychological conditioning that defined the Sullivan basement. 47 children, each unique, yet subjected to identical routines designed to fracture will and reshape identity. Fear became instinct, isolation became reality, and hope grew fragile, almost impossible to sustain. Every day, the children were molded by their environment, trained to accept obedience as the only viable option. The chains were physical, yes, but the true captivity was mental. Their minds were confined, reshaped by repetition, deprivation, and relentless uncertainty. The brilliance of such control lies in its invisibility. The world above, unaware or indifferent, reinforced the conditions of captivity. Societal norms, cultural expectations, and social distraction acted as invisible enforcers, conditioning compliance without direct confrontation. The Sullivan basement is a case study in the efficiency of subtle manipulation, the architecture of fear, the shaping of perception, and the reinforcement of obedience through psychological, rather than purely physical, mechanisms. It demonstrates how control can be absolute without spectacle, and here is a chilling realization. This pattern extends far beyond the basement. Systems of authority, whether political, social, or institutional, often replicate the same principles. Isolation, misinformation, fear, and structured routines quietly mold behavior and perception. Compliance becomes internalized, and the mechanisms remain invisible to the untrained eye. Understanding this is dangerous knowledge. It shifts your perception of human behavior, authority, and the hidden forces shaping society. Now, as you feel the weight of this awareness, recognize the transformation within yourself. The basement is no longer simply a physical space. It is a symbol, a blueprint, a warning. Chains and stone walls are manifestations of a much broader architecture of control. And as we continue, you will see how these principles, first observed in the Sullivan basement, echo through history, shaping lives, societies, and human behavior in ways most people never perceive. Now, let us confront the hidden agendas that allowed the Sullivan basement to exist for so long. This was not mere negligence. It was deliberate orchestration. Every silence, every distraction, every socially convenient explanation served a purpose: to protect the architects of control and maintain the illusion of normalcy. The children's suffering was invisible because the surrounding society was conditioned to look away. Power, in this context, does not rely on force alone. It relies on the subtle manipulation of perception, ensuring compliance without confrontation. Consider the networks of complicity. Officials who should have intervened, neighbors who ignored, warning signs, and cultural norms that discouraged questioning all were instrumental in preserving the secrecy. This is a timeless principle. When societal structures prioritize appearances over accountability, hidden atrocities can thrive. The Sullivan basement, horrifying in its specifics, becomes a symbol of a universal pattern, one in which authority, secrecy, and societal complacency combine to perpetuate unseen suffering. And here is the crucial lesson: subtlety often achieves more than brute force. Isolation, fear, and repetition reshape behavior more efficiently than overt punishment. The children internalized their captivity. Their obedience became instinctual, their reality defined by control. This microcosm of manipulation reflects broader systems of power throughout history, where knowledge is restricted, dissent is discouraged, and authority operates without scrutiny. Understanding this is both empowering and dangerous. It awakens recognition, but also exposes the uncomfortable truth of human systems. Now, as you absorb this, feel the descent deepen. The basement is no longer simply a site of historical horror. It is a lens into the architecture of power itself. The chains, shadows, and silence are metaphors for structures that govern human behavior quietly, invisibly, and persistently. Awareness of these patterns transforms perception, reshapes understanding, and demands a confrontation with truths that most choose to ignore. And as we continue, the next revelations will challenge the boundaries of comfort and knowledge, drawing you further into forbidden history and the mechanics of control. Now, we descend into the lasting psychological consequences of the Sullivan basement, a legacy that extends far beyond the chains and stone walls. The children, confined and controlled, were not merely victims of circumstance. They were subjects of systematic psychological conditioning. Isolation, fear, and monotony reshaped cognition and perception. Hope became fragile, rebellion nearly impossible. Every day was a lesson in submission, every shadow a reinforcement of control. And when the world above remained indifferent, the children internalized their captivity as reality itself. Consider the long-term implications. This is not simply a historical tragedy. It is a study in how environments shape minds, often invisibly. Trauma, learned helplessness, and internalized fear became the invisible chains that extended well beyond the basement. The children's sense of self, their understanding of freedom, and their expectations of authority were irreversibly altered. And the mechanisms that created these effects, the calculated routines, the secrecy, the societal blind spots, reflect patterns that are still used by systems of power to shape human behavior quietly and efficiently. And here is a sobering truth: such mechanisms are not confined to the past. Modern institutions, governments, and social structures often employ subtle forms of psychological control. Isolation, misinformation, fear, and enforced conformity are the invisible chains of our era, shaping thought and behavior without overt coercion. The basement is a historical mirror, revealing principles that operate whenever secrecy, authority, and compliance intersect. Recognizing these patterns awakens perception, but it also forces you to confront uncomfortable realities about human systems and the subtle forces that govern them. Now, as awareness settles, you feel the descent deepen. The basement, once a physical space, becomes a symbol, a warning of what occurs when power operates invisibly and cruelty is obscured by social norms. Chains, darkness, and silence reflect broader principles of domination, control, and societal complicity. And as we continue, the next sections will guide you even further into hidden agendas, forbidden knowledge, and the invisible architectures of power that have shaped human history in ways most people will never see. Now, let us confront the role of institutional manipulation in sustaining the horror of the Sullivan basement. The chains may have restrained bodies, but institutions restrained minds. Local authorities, social hierarchies, and cultural norms created a system where questioning was discouraged, oversight was minimal, and concealment was rewarded. This is a timeless principle. Power is most effective when it is invisible, when compliance is internalized, and when the structures above provide plausible deniability. The basement, therefore, is not only a site of atrocity, is a lesson in the subtle architecture of systemic control. Consider how easily the truth can be hidden, reports dismissed, anomalies ignored, social pressure applied. These are the instruments of control that extend beyond physical confinement. Authority, when unchallenged and insulated from scrutiny, enables horrors to persist silently. The Sullivan basement serves as a stark reminder that institutions often prioritize appearances over accountability, and that the consequences of invisibility are devastating. 47 children were hidden, controlled, and psychologically manipulated, while the larger system continued as if nothing were wrong. And here is the essential insight. Subtlety is more powerful than overt brutality. Isolation, psychological pressure, and normalized routines shape behavior far more efficiently than force alone. The children internalized control, obedience became instinct, and fear became second nature. This microcosm reflects broader patterns in society, history, and human institutions, where unseen forces guide perception, shape compliance, and obscure knowledge. Understanding this equips you to recognize manipulation, but it also confronts you with uncomfortable truths about the nature of authority and secrecy. Now, as you integrate this knowledge, feel the descent deepen. The basement, its shadows, and its silence are no longer confined to history. They are a lens to perceive the invisible architecture of power around you. Chains, isolation, and fear symbolize the mechanisms that perpetuate control, often unnoticed. As we move forward into the next section, the revelations grow darker, revealing hidden agendas, forbidden truths, and the psychological intricacies that sustained the Sullivan basement for so long. Now, we confront the covert mechanisms of social control that allowed the Sullivan basement to endure. Beyond chains and stone, the system relied on human behavior, fear, distraction, obedience, and indifference. Neighbors whispered excuses, officials accepted convenient explanations, and society remained comfortably unaware. This is the essence of hidden power. It operates not only through force, but through shaping perception, dictating norms, and conditioning silence. The horror of the basement was magnified by what people refused or were conditioned not to see. Consider the subtlety of this control. Isolation fractures identity, monotony dulls resistance, and fear becomes instinct. These children were subjected to an environment meticulously engineered to suppress rebellion and normalize suffering. Above ground, the larger society became an unwitting accomplice, distracted by daily life, reinforced by assumptions, and conditioned to defer to authority. The basement is a stark lesson in the efficiency of subtlety. Cruelty need not scream to succeed. It only needs invisibility, structure, and patience. And here is the critical insight. These principles are timeless. Societies, institutions, and organizations often employ the same mechanisms to shape behavior quietly. Isolation, misinformation, social pressure, and repetition mold thought and action far more effectively than overt oppression. The Sullivan basement, horrifying in its specifics, mirrors the hidden architecture of influence and control. that persists today. Recognizing these patterns awakens perception, but also carries weight. The uncomfortable awareness that human systems can operate with devastating subtlety and efficiency. Now, as you absorb this, the basement becomes more than history. It becomes a lens through which to perceive the invisible forces shaping society and human behavior. The chains, the shadows, and the silence are metaphors for systems of control, revealing how authority, secrecy, and compliance intersect to produce enduring patterns of domination. And as we continue, the next section will reveal the final descent into forbidden knowledge, the lessons the Sullivan basement imparts about power, secrecy, and the human capacity for both cruelty and complicity. Now we approach the final revelations, the forbidden truths the Sullivan basement holds about power, secrecy, and human behavior. 47 children, hidden, controlled, and broken, serve as more than victims. They are symbols of systemic manipulation. Chains and stone are physical, but the true architecture of control is invisible. Fear, isolation, repetition, and social conditioning. These forces shape perception, enforce obedience, and obscure truth, demonstrating the terrifying efficiency of subtle, unseen power. Consider the societal complicity once more. Silence was maintained not only by the perpetrators, but by the observers, the distracted, and the indifferent. Authority went unquestioned, norms went unchallenged, and convenience replaced conscience. This is the principle that extends beyond history. Power is sustained most effectively when it is invisible, when obedience is internalized, and when those who might interfere are conditioned to look away. The basement is a chilling lesson in how human systems can perpetuate suffering quietly and efficiently. And here is the final insight. The lessons of the basement extend far beyond 1834 Virginia. They reveal the structures underlying institutions, governments, and social hierarchies. They show how fear, conformity, and invisibility can be engineered to maintain control. Understanding this knowledge is transformative and dangerous. It awakens perception, reshapes understanding, and forces recognition of patterns that most would prefer remain unseen. The basement is both historical fact and enduring metaphor, a mirror reflecting the mechanics of hidden power that persist in every era. Now, as you internalize this, feel the gravity of awareness. The Sullivan basement is no longer simply a site of horror. It is a lens through which to see the invisible forces that shape lives, behavior, and societies. Chains, darkness, silence, and complacency are not just history, they are ongoing lessons in control, manipulation, and complicity. And as we move to the final section, you will confront the ultimate truth about forbidden knowledge. Once seen, it cannot be unseen, and understanding it transforms perception forever. Now, in the penultimate descent, we confront the enduring implications of the Sullivan basement. This is more than history. It is a blueprint for understanding human systems, both past and present. 47 children confined, controlled, and broken, revealed the mechanics of power, invisibility, subtle coercion, and the orchestration of perception. Chains and stone are symbols, but the real instruments are psychological and societal fear, isolation, repetition, and complacency. The basement teaches that oppression does not always announce itself. It thrives in silence, invisibility, and normalized obedience. Consider the lessons for today. Authority operates in similar ways. Information is controlled, curiosity discouraged, dissent suppressed. Compliance is often internalized, and suffering hidden behind structures of legitimacy and routine. The Sullivan basement is a warning. Observe patterns, question appearances, and recognize the unseen forces shaping behavior and society. Awareness is transformative, but it carries a weight to recognition that such mechanisms are always present, often invisible, and devastatingly effective. And here is the final principle before our conclusion. Subtlety, patience, and invisibility are the most efficient tools of control. Brutality is obvious and attracts attention. Manipulation is silent, precise, and enduring. 47 lives, trapped in a basement, illustrate this principle in its most extreme form. But echoes of this architecture appear across centuries, institutions, and cultures. To understand it is to awaken perception and see the hidden scaffolding of human behavior and power. Now, as you reflect, the Sullivan basement becomes a mirror revealing not just historical horror, but the enduring patterns that govern human systems, authority, and perception. The chains, darkness, and silence are not merely relics. They are ongoing lessons, warnings, and symbols of the hidden architecture that shapes reality. And as we prepare for the final section, know this: the ultimate truth of forbidden knowledge awaits, one that changes perception forever and solidifies the lessons of power, secrecy, and human complicity. Now, we reach the final descent, the ultimate truth the Sullivan basement imparts. 47 children, hidden, chained, and broken, reveal more than historical horror. They reveal the mechanics of power, secrecy, and human compliance. Chains, darkness, and silence were physical tools, but the true instruments were psychological and societal. Fear, isolation, repetition, and orchestrated ignorance. The basement becomes a mirror for every system where authority operates unseen, obedience is internalized, and suffering is normalized. Understand this: forbidden knowledge is transformative. Once you see the patterns, the hidden agendas, the societal complicity, the psychological manipulation, you cannot unsee them. Awareness awakens perception, but it also imposes responsibility. Recognizing invisible structures of control means recognizing where they exist today, how they shape thought, behavior, and culture. The basement is not just a relic of 1834 Virginia. It is a blueprint for understanding hidden systems that govern human lives across time and space. And here is the final warning: power thrives on invisibility, subtlety, and normalized compliance. Institutions, governments, and hierarchies often operate according to these principles. Chains may have vanished, but invisible mechanisms endure. Recognize them, understand them, and never allow complacency to obscure what you now know. 47 lives were altered irreversibly, and the lessons they embody extend far beyond history. They are a guide to perceiving hidden truths, resisting manipulation, and awakening awareness. Finally, reflect on the gravity of what you have seen. The Sullivan basement, with its shadows, chains, and silence, is a lens into forbidden knowledge. Once recognized, the patterns of control, manipulation, and hidden authority shape your perception forever. Awareness is both gift and burden. You are now equipped to see what most cannot, to understand what most ignore, and to recognize the invisible forces that govern not just history, but the present and the future. This is the descent complete. Forbidden knowledge revealed, chains broken in understanding, shadows illuminated, and the hidden truths now within your awareness. The basement is no longer just a place, it is a symbol of the architecture of power, secrecy, and compliance, eternally echoing through time.